The sky over the Solomon Islands is already heavy with heat. Late afternoon light glints off the ocean below, broken only by thin cloud and the distant smear of jungle-covered land. At altitude, a Japanese naval fighter patrol moves in loose formation, scanning for targets. These skies, once uncontested, still feel familiar, still feel owned. Then something appears ahead. It is large, unusually shaped. A fighter with bent wings and a thick nose, moving faster than expected, climbing instead of turning away. Some Japanese pilots had already given it a name, half mocking, half dismissive. Too bulky, too clumsy. A machine that could never dance, like a Zero. An aircraft that looked more like an engineering mistake than a threat. The Corsair does not turn to meet them. It climbs. The distance closes in seconds. Then the sky flashes white. 6 streams of .40 caliber fire reach out across the air, stitching metal and fuel together with ruthless precision. What follows is not a turning fight, not a contest of elegance, but a sudden, violent unraveling. As smoke begins to fall toward the sea, the assumptions of the early Pacific Air War fall with it, pulling the story back to how this moment was made possible at all. By the time the Corsair first carved its presence into the skies of the Pacific, the war there had already rewritten every assumption about air combat. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor with precision and confidence born from years of doctrinal focus on naval aviation. In the months that followed, Imperial Japanese forces advanced across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with alarming speed. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines were overwhelmed. Wake Island, Guam, and the Dutch East Indies followed. At sea and in the air, Japan appeared unstoppable. Much of that dominance rested in the cockpit. Japanese naval aviators were among the most experienced pilots in the world. Their training before the war was long, selective, and unforgiving. Only a fraction of candidates survived the process, and those who did were taught to fly by feel rather than procedure. Combat instincts were honed through endless hours in the air. By 1941, many Japanese pilots had more than 1,000 flight hours. Some had already fought in China. Their primary weapon, the Mitsubishi A6M0, embodied this philosophy. Light, agile, and long-ranged, it could outturn almost anything the Allies could put into the sky. In the opening battles of the Pacific, the Zero dominated American aircraft, like the F4F Wildcat. U.S. Navy and Marine pilots quickly learned that traditional dogfighting meant death. Tight turns ended with tracers slicing through wings and cockpits. Early American losses were severe, and they were sobering. The United States had entered the war with aircraft designed under pre-war assumptions. Fighters expected to engage at lower speeds, shorter ranges, and within visual maneuvering battles. The Pacific shattered those expectations. Engagements happened far from carriers, often above vast stretches of ocean. Survivability mattered. Firepower mattered. Speed and climb mattered. But in late 1941 and early 1942, the U.S. simply did not yet have the tools. The Grumman F4F Wildcat, though rugged and capable in the hands of disciplined pilots, was already nearing the limits of its development. It could absorb punishment, but it lacked speed and climb. Its 4 or 6.50 caliber machine guns were effective, but only if they could be brought to bear. Against the Zero, American pilots were forced into defensive tactics, diving away, relying on teamwork, and avoiding prolonged engagements. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps knew this could not last. Even before Pearl Harbor, American engineers had been working on a new generation of fighters. They understood that future air combat would be faster, higher, and more lethal. Engines were becoming more powerful. Airframes were growing larger. Firepower was increasing. The margin for error was shrinking. One company in particular had decided to push every boundary at once. Chance Vought, a Connecticut-based manufacturer, had begun designing a fighter around the largest, most powerful engine available to the United States, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It was an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower, far more than any previous naval fighter had ever carried. To harness that power, everything else had to change. The propeller alone measured over 13 feet in diameter. To clear it from carrier decks, engineers bent the wings downward and then back up again, creating the distinctive inverted gull wing. The fuselage was long and muscular. The cockpit was set far back, limiting forward visibility but improving balance. Armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks were added, increasing weight but vastly improving survivability. On paper, the aircraft promised speed, climb, and firepower unmatched in the Pacific. In practice, it terrified test pilots. Early flights revealed dangerous stall characteristics. Landing speeds were high. The long nose blocked the deck during carrier approaches. Bounces during landing could send the aircraft back into the air at the worst possible moment. For Navy carrier operations, the aircraft was deemed too dangerous, at least for now. So while the war raged on in 1942, the Corsair remained in an uncertain limbo. It existed as a solution to a problem the United States knew it had, but had not yet fully learned how to use. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots continued to dominate the skies, unaware that an aircraft designed not to turn with them, but to destroy them outright, was waiting just beyond the horizon. And it was the details of that design, its engine, its weapons, and the philosophy behind them, that would soon define the next phase of the air war. While the Corsair struggled to find its place operationally, the Pacific War continued to accelerate toward a test of endurance neither side had fully anticipated. By mid-1942, the momentum that had carried Japanese forces across half an ocean began to slow. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May halted a direct threat to Australia. 1 month later, at Midway, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in a single day. The balance of naval power shifted abruptly, not in territory, but in possibility. Japan could still fight. It could still strike. But it could no longer replace experienced pilots or capital ships at the rate the United States could. Yet in the air, the Zero remained a deadly opponent. American pilots entering combat in 1942 and early 1943 were still facing veterans trained under pre-war Japanese doctrine. These men had refined their tactics in China and over the open ocean. They understood energy management intuitively. They exploited the Zero's strengths: low wing loading, exceptional turning ability, and long range to control engagements on their terms. What they could not yet see was how the nature of aerial combat itself was about to change. The Corsair's design was not a refinement of earlier fighters. It was a philosophical break. At its heart was speed. With the R2800 engine driving that massive propeller, the Corsair could exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, a figure that fundamentally altered engagement geometry. In a dive, it could accelerate faster than nearly any Japanese fighter. Its climb rate once properly managed, allowed it to regain altitude rapidly after an attack. This meant the Corsair was never intended to fight the Zero in circles. It was built to strike from above, hit hard, and leave before the enemy could respond. The aircraft's armament reflected this intent with brutal clarity. Mounted in its wings were 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, each fed by hundreds of rounds. Together, they could deliver more than 75 rounds per second. At convergence, that volume of fire turned thin aluminum skin, unprotected fuel tanks, and lightly built airframes into debris almost instantly. Japanese fighters, designed for agility and range, carried little armor. Many had no self-sealing fuel tanks. This had been an acceptable trade-off early in the war, when enemy aircraft lacked the speed or firepower to exploit it. Against the Corsair, that vulnerability became fatal. But the Corsair's early reputation did not reflect its potential. Initial deployment was delayed by carrier concerns, so the aircraft went first to the U.S. Marine Corps, operating from rough airstrips carved out of jungle and coral. In February 1943, Corsairs arrived on Guadalcanal. The runways were uneven. Maintenance conditions were primitive. Visibility on approach was poor. Yet away from the carrier deck, the aircraft began to show what it could do. Marine pilots learned quickly. They were warned never to turn with a Zero. Instead, they climbed high above patrol zones, using altitude as stored energy. When Japanese aircraft appeared, Corsairs dove at extreme speed, firing in a single high-deflection pass. If the target survived, the Corsair climbed away, repositioned, and attacked again. Japanese pilots encountering the Corsair for the first time often misjudged it. It looked heavy. Its wings looked awkward. It did not maneuver like the fighters they were used to. Some attempted to draw it into turning fights, confident in their advantage. Others underestimated its speed, believing they could outrun or outclimb it. They were wrong. The Corsair could choose when to fight. It could choose when to disengage. And when its guns spoke, they did so with a decisiveness Japanese pilots had not previously encountered. By late 1943, combat reports began to circulate within the Imperial Japanese Navy, noting a new American fighter, one that refused traditional engagement patterns and inflicted disproportionate losses in seconds. The mockery faded first. The concern followed quickly after. What remained was adaptation or extinction, and it was in the human experiences, the tactics, and the shifting psychology of those encounters that the true story of the Corsair began to unfold. For American pilots arriving in the Pacific in 1943, the Corsair was both a promise and a warning. It was powerful, unforgiving, and demanded discipline. Many pilots transitioning from Wildcats or trainers found its torque overwhelming. On takeoff, the aircraft pulled violently to the left. On landing, a moment's inattention could send it bouncing or ground looping across coral runways. Accidents were common. Some units lost more aircraft to training mishaps than to enemy fire in their early weeks. But once mastered, the Corsair inspired something close to confidence. Marine pilots spoke of the aircraft as a machine that would keep them alive if they respected it. The cockpit was armored. The fuel tanks sealed themselves after hits. Pilots could take damage and still return home. Against an enemy whose fighters often burned after a single burst, this mattered deeply. For Japanese pilots, the encounter was disorienting. They were accustomed to dictating terms. The Zero's turning ability had been its shield and its sword. Against the Corsair, that shield failed. American pilots did not chase. They did not follow into turns. They struck and disappeared upward, leaving shattered aircraft behind them. Survivors described the shock of seeing wings shear away or fuel ignite instantly. There was no prolonged fight, no time to react. The engagement was often over before it truly began. The Corsair forced a tactical redefinition of air combat in the Pacific. American doctrine shifted decisively toward energy fighting. Altitude became safety. Speed became control. Squadrons coordinated high-altitude patrols, using radar cues and visual spotting to position themselves above incoming Japanese formations. The attack sequence was precise. Dive steeply, fire once, break away at speed, climb back to altitude, repeat. Japanese pilots, trained to rely on instinctive maneuvering, struggled against this method. The Zero could not dive safely at the same speeds. Its controls stiffened. Structural limits were tested. Attempts to follow often ended in disintegration or loss of control. In combat reports, American pilots noted a recurring pattern. Japanese aircraft trying to turn upward to follow a departing Corsair, stalling and falling behind, exposed. At the center of this imbalance was the Browning M2. The 05T caliber machine gun was not new, but in the Corsair it was applied with overwhelming effect. 6 guns, tightly grouped, firing incendiary and armor-piercing rounds, created a dense cone of destruction. Japanese aircraft construction, optimized for lightness, could not absorb such punishment. Control cables snapped. Engines seized. Fuel tanks ruptured. In many engagements, a single burst was sufficient. The Corsair did not need prolonged contact. It needed only a fraction of a second within range. The rest was physics. And as these realities spread through both air forces, the balance between hunter and hunted began to tilt toward a decisive reckoning. By late 1943, American air commanders in the Pacific had begun to understand that the Corsair was not merely a new aircraft, it was a doctrinal weapon. U.S. Marine and Navy leadership emphasized discipline over bravado. Pilots were drilled repeatedly on what not to do. Never turn with a Zero. Never chase a damaged aircraft into a low-altitude fight. Never descend below friendly cover without a clear advantage. The Corsair's strengths were to be preserved, not squandered. This approach contrasted sharply with early war habits, when inexperienced pilots often attempted to prove themselves in close combat. The Corsair demanded restraint. Commanders, such as Major Gregory Pappy, Boyington himself, a deeply flawed but combat-savvy leader, reinforced this reality in the field. His squadron, VMF 214, flew Corsairs aggressively but not carelessly. They used altitude as insurance and massed firepower as finality. Boyington himself would later credit the aircraft's speed and armament with allowing his pilots to survive encounters that would have been fatal in earlier fighters. On the Japanese side, leadership faced a different problem. Losses were mounting, and replacements were arriving with drastically reduced training. The long pre-war pilot pipeline had been shortened out of necessity. New aviators entered combat with a fraction of the experience their predecessors possessed. Against an aircraft that punished mistakes instantly, this deficit proved devastating. Orders were issued to avoid head-on engagements. Pilots were instructed to lure American fighters downward. Yet without speed or altitude parity, these tactics rarely succeeded. Japanese after-action reports from 1943 and 1944 reveal a growing awareness of the Corsair's threat. Pilots described an American fighter that fell from the sky and vanished before defensive fire could be organized. They noted the impossibility of pursuit. They recorded losses that occurred without warning. The Corsair's silhouette, once ridiculed, became recognizable and feared. Some Japanese pilots attempted adaptations. High-speed slashing attacks were tried. Vertical maneuvers were emphasized. But the Zero's structural limitations and lack of dive tolerance restricted these efforts. Each attempted innovation was constrained by an aircraft designed for a different era of air combat. Beyond tactics and technology, the Corsair reshaped the psychological battlefield. For American pilots, confidence replaced desperation. Engagements no longer felt like contests of survival, but exercises in control. The knowledge that their aircraft could absorb damage, outrun the enemy, and end fights quickly reduced hesitation. For Japanese pilots, the air war grew increasingly fatalistic. The sky no longer belonged to skill alone. It belonged to speed, altitude, and firepower. Encounters with Corsairs often ended without honor or spectacle, only sudden destruction. By early 1944, the emotional balance had shifted decisively. The Corsair was no longer an unknown. It was a symbol of an air war that Japan could not win on its original terms. And as this imbalance widened, it led inevitably to moments where the Corsair's dominance would be tested not in isolated encounters, but in sustained, large-scale combat, where the outcome would no longer be in doubt. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific Air War entered a phase where outcomes were no longer decided by surprise or individual brilliance, but by systems colliding with one another in full view. The Corsair was now everywhere it could be effective. From Bougainville to New Britain, from the Solomons to the skies over Rabaul, Marine and Navy squadrons flew daily patrols. They escorted bombers. They hunted interceptors. They swept enemy airspace with deliberate intent. The aircraft that had once been considered unsafe for carrier decks had become indispensable on forward airstrips, where its long takeoff roll and heavy landing were acceptable prices for what it delivered in combat. The Japanese responded as best they could. Rabaul, once the linchpin of Japanese air power in the South Pacific, became a focal point. Its airfields launched waves of fighters to contest American advances. But these pilots were no longer the elite of 1941. Many had fewer than 200 flight hours. Some had never fired their guns in anger before entering combat. They climbed anyway. On February 19, 1944, American forces struck Rabaul in strength. Carrier aircraft and land-based fighters converged in coordinated attacks. Among them were Corsairs flying top cover, positioned high above the bombers, waiting. Japanese fighters rose to intercept. What followed was not a dogfight in the traditional sense. It was a sequence of brief, violent contacts. Corsairs dove from altitude at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Pilots fired short bursts, 1 second, sometimes less. At that speed and concentration of fire, hits were catastrophic. Aircraft disintegrated. Engines stopped instantly. Fires erupted so suddenly that pilots had no time to bail out. American pilots reported that Japanese formations broke apart almost immediately. Attempts to regroup failed. Those who tried to turn were left behind. Those who tried to climb stalled beneath pursuing Corsairs. The kill ratios reflected this imbalance with brutal clarity. In multiple engagements during early 1944, Corsair units reported claims exceeding 10-1. In some actions, no American aircraft were lost at all. Maintenance crews on the ground began to notice something new: returning aircraft with empty ammunition belts and little damage. The M2 Brownings had done their work. At convergence range, typically between 250 and 300 yards, the 6 guns produced a dense pattern that no lightly built aircraft could survive. Japanese fighters often absorbed dozens of hits in a single pass. Control surfaces vanished, wings folded, fuel ignited. Japanese pilots, conditioned to expect turning engagements, found themselves dying without ever seeing the face of their attacker. The psychological impact was immediate. Radio intercepts and intelligence reports indicated rising panic. Pilots reported large American fighters attacking from above, impossible to follow. Some units began refusing to climb to intercept unless ordered directly. Others attempted to disperse, only to be hunted individually. For the Corsair pilots, the sky had become something different. It was no longer a place of uncertainty. It was a hunting ground defined by altitude bands, attack windows, and escape vectors. Every engagement followed a rhythm: climb, wait, dive, fire, disengage. The turning point was not a single battle, but a realization shared across both air forces that the rules governing survival had permanently changed. And as American operations expanded northward and carrier compatibility issues were finally resolved, the Corsair was about to bring this dominance to the heart of Japanese defensive airspace itself. By late 1944, the Corsair was no longer confined to rough island strips or marine-only squadrons. Its early problems with carrier landings had been mitigated through modifications, improved pilot training, and hard-earned experience. The U.S. Navy, once hesitant, now embraced the aircraft in growing numbers. The timing was decisive. American forces were advancing toward the Philippines. The scale of operations dwarfed anything previously attempted in the Pacific. Hundreds of ships moved in coordinated formations. Carrier task forces projected air power across entire regions. The sky above these fleets became a layered system of patrols, interception zones, and kill boxes. Corsairs took their place within that system. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Corsair squadrons flew combat air patrols over invasion beaches and fleet anchors. Japanese air resistance, once formidable, now arrived in fragmented waves. Some pilots were barely trained. Others were already resigned to not returning. When interceptions occurred, the outcome was rarely in doubt. Corsairs engaged at altitude, diving through enemy formations with overwhelming speed. Their firepower tore through aircraft that could neither evade nor retaliate effectively. In several documented encounters, Japanese fighters were destroyed before reaching weapon release range on American ships. Statistics from this period illustrate the scale of the shift. By the end of the war, Corsair pilots would claim over 2,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, with an overall kill ratio exceeding 11-1. In some Marine squadrons, the ratio was significantly higher. The aircraft had become one of the most lethal fighters of the conflict, but numbers alone failed to capture the transformation. Japanese pilots now avoided engagements whenever possible. Some attempted low-altitude approaches, skimming the sea to evade detection. Others climbed reluctantly, aware that altitude invited destruction. The sky had become hostile territory. The M2 Brownings, once simply a specification, now defined the encounter. 6 guns firing in unison created a curtain through which Japanese aircraft could not pass. The Corsair did not need to outmaneuver. It only needed to intersect the enemy's path for a fraction of a second. Combat reports from American pilots grew increasingly clinical. One burst. Enemy aircraft exploded. Closed from above. Wings detached. For Japanese air commanders, the implications were grim. Every loss was irreplaceable. Fuel shortages limited training. Industrial output could not match American production. The Corsair symbolized a technological gap that doctrine alone could not bridge. By early 1945, organized Japanese fighter resistance in many sectors had effectively collapsed. Kamikaze tactics emerged not as a strategy of strength, but of desperation, an acknowledgement that conventional air combat had been lost. The Corsair remained in the air, methodically enforcing that reality. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the skies over the Pacific grew quieter, not because the fighting had ended, but because one side no longer had the means to contest them. And in that silence, the consequences of the Corsair's dominance began to settle into history. When the fighting moved on and the airfields fell silent, the Corsair's impact did not fade with the sound of its engine. It lingered in numbers, in altered doctrine, and in the visible absence of an enemy that had once ruled the sky. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm was effectively shattered. Where once experienced pilots had formed the backbone of its striking power, now only fragments remained. Training units pressed into combat, poorly prepared and under-equipped. The attrition inflicted by American fighters, especially the Corsair, had stripped away the institutional memory that had defined Japan's early success. The aircraft's contribution was measurable. Operational records show that Corsair squadrons maintained some of the highest kill ratios of any Allied fighter in the Pacific. The combination of speed, durability, and firepower meant fewer losses per mission and a higher likelihood of pilots surviving to fight again. This, in turn, created a feedback loop of experience. American pilots grew more effective over time, while Japanese pilots grew less so. Strategically, the Corsair altered how air superiority was enforced. American planners increasingly relied on high-altitude fighter sweeps to preempt Japanese interceptions. Bombers flew with confidence. Naval task forces operated under protective air umbrellas that reduced vulnerability to conventional air attack. Even as kamikaze operations intensified, the presence of Corsairs on combat air patrol significantly reduced the number of aircraft that reached their targets. The psychological effect was equally profound. For Japanese forces on the ground, the sound of American fighters overhead became a constant reminder of vulnerability. Supply convoys moved at night. Airfields dispersed aircraft under camouflage, knowing that daylight invited destruction. The initiative had shifted permanently. For American pilots, the Corsair became synonymous with survivability. Many returned from missions with aircraft riddled by holes that would have doomed lighter fighters. Maintenance crews patched wings, replaced control cables, and sent the same aircraft back into the air within days. This durability mattered beyond individual missions. It sustained momentum. It preserved experience. It reinforced confidence. By the war's final months, the Corsair was no longer a novel weapon. It was a system integrated into every level of American air power, from close air support to fleet defense. Its presence was assumed. Its absence would have been unthinkable. Yet as the war drew to a close, the question shifted from what the Corsair had done to what its dominance revealed about the changing nature of warfare itself. And that reckoning continued after the guns fell silent. In the immediate post-war years, the Corsair's record underwent close examination by historians, engineers, and military planners seeking to understand not just why it worked, but what it signified. The conclusions were stark. The Corsair had not won because it was elegant. It had not won because it was forgiving. It won because it aligned perfectly with the direction warfare had already begun to move. Speed over maneuver. Firepower over finesse. Survivability over lightness. Japanese post-war assessments, compiled under Allied supervision, quietly acknowledged this shift. The Zero, once a marvel, had been overtaken by the realities of modern combat. Its strengths, turning ability, and range were rendered secondary by opponents who refused to fight on those terms. Against concentrated heavy machine gun fire delivered at extreme speed, the Zero's design philosophy collapsed. For American aviation, the Corsair became a template. Its success reinforced the value of powerful engines, robust construction, and overwhelming armament. These lessons carried forward into the jet age, influencing how fighters would be built and flown long after propellers disappeared from the front line. The aircraft's longevity underscored its effectiveness. Corsairs continued flying well after 1945. They served in Korea, where they once again proved capable of absorbing punishment and delivering decisive firepower, this time against ground targets. Few aircraft designs demonstrated such adaptability across eras, but perhaps the most lasting legacy lay in what the Corsair represented psychologically. It marked the moment when the Pacific Air War ceased to be a contest of individual skill and became an industrial systemic struggle, one side able to impose its will through technology, training, and production. The Corsair was not invincible. Pilots still died. Mistakes were still fatal. But the margin for survival had shifted decisively. For Japanese pilots who encountered it late in the war, the Corsair symbolized inevitability. For American pilots, it symbolized control. And in the decades that followed, as war receded into memory, the bent-wing silhouette of the Corsair came to represent a turning point, when mockery gave way to respect, and respect gave way to silence in the sky. That silence, heavy and final, invites reflection. In the end, the story of the F4U Corsair is not merely a tale of speed, firepower, or design ingenuity. It is a story of adaptation, of how technology can reshape human expectations and rewrite the rules of engagement. What once looked awkward, oversized, and unwieldy became lethal in the hands of disciplined pilots. What Japanese aviators initially mocked, the Corsair's bent wings, its massive engine, its sheer bulk, became the instruments of their defeat. In those brief, violent seconds of combat, the machine demonstrated a truth that would echo through aviation history: control, protection, and concentrated firepower could outweigh elegance and agility. Beyond the numbers and statistics lies a deeper lesson. The Corsair exemplified the convergence of human skill and mechanical capability. It forced pilots to respect discipline, to master tactics, and to understand that survival in war depended as much on preparation and doctrine as on courage or instinct. It also revealed the limits of underestimating an opponent, a lesson painfully learned by the Japanese pilots who met it in the sky. Yet there is a quiet humanity beneath the roar of its engine. Every pilot on both sides faced choices measured in fractions of seconds. Every engagement carried stakes that could not be rehearsed. The Corsair did not fight alone. It amplified the resolve, judgment, and precision of those who flew it. Its legacy is not just in the destruction it wrought, but in the clarity it brought to air combat. The Pacific skies were forever changed, and with them, the understanding of what modern aerial warfare could demand. And as the sun sets over those distant islands, leaving the silhouettes of Corsairs etched against the horizon, one is reminded that history often rewards those who blend innovation with strategy, and punishes those who fail to recognize it. The Corsair did not merely win battles. It reshaped the very nature of the fight.